For generations, the world has looked to America as the unshakable center of power, the nation that seemed immune to decline, the system that others tried to imitate, but could never fully replicate. It created the largest economy, the strongest military, the most influential culture, and the most dominant currency. From the outside, this projected an aura of permanence, as if the foundations of American power were carved in stone. But history has always punished those who confuse dominance with destiny. The illusion of endless power is perhaps the most dangerous weakness a nation can possess, because it blinds its leaders, its institutions, and even its people from the reality of change that is unfolding before their eyes. The weakness does not come from rivals, nor from enemies who challenge its status. It comes from within, from the false belief that the game will always be played under the same rules, with the same referee, and with the same outcome. The 20th century cemented this illusion. After 2 world wars, America emerged not just victorious, but elevated. Its factories were untouched, its population confident, and its financial system elevated into a global standard. The dollar became the lifeblood of international trade. The security alliances it built became the framework of global order, and its corporations became symbols of ambition without limits. From that moment onward, the story of American dominance seemed unshakable. But the problem with stories is that they are written by people who assume tomorrow will mirror yesterday. When a nation begins to assume that its supremacy is guaranteed, it slowly loses the urgency that created that supremacy in the first place. This is why empires do not fall suddenly from external pressure. They decline gradually because they fail to notice how the world is shifting underneath them. Power has always depended on perception. The perception of American power was built not only on military and economic strength, but also on the belief that it could adapt faster than anyone else. Innovation, risk-taking, and reinvention defined its growth. Yet illusions turn dangerous when they disguise stagnation as stability. While America projected dominance, the very engines of its competitiveness began to slow. Manufacturing that once dominated global markets was hollowed out by the pursuit of efficiency abroad. Innovation that once disrupted industries slowed under the weight of bureaucracy and short-term profit obsession. A society that once valued bold risk became one that managed decline by protecting what it already had. The illusion remained on the surface: skyscrapers, financial markets, military bases. But the foundations underneath began to show cracks. Illusions also create arrogance. A nation convinced of its unshakable dominance starts to ignore the signals that the world is changing. The rise of other economies was initially dismissed as temporary. The creation of alternative systems treated as irrelevant, and the shifting trust of allies regarded as manageable. But when illusions are maintained too long, they lead to miscalculations. Leaders fail to prepare for scenarios where their influence does not automatically dictate outcomes. They underestimate rivals. They overestimate the loyalty of partners. And they dismiss the dissatisfaction of their own citizens until the cracks widen into fractures. The illusion of endless power breeds complacency. And complacency is always the first step toward vulnerability. There is also a psychological cost to this illusion. When a society has been told for generations that it leads the world, it begins to internalize that narrative. The citizens grow up assuming their country will always be number one, that the lifestyle they enjoy is permanent, that the rest of the world will keep depending on their currency, their markets, and their protection. But when reality shifts and the illusion is challenged, the shock is deeper than in any other nation. Others may expect cycles of rise and fall, but America built its identity on the belief of permanent dominance. When that illusion cracks, the response is not calm adaptation, but anger, denial, and division. This makes the weakness even more dangerous, because it is not only strategic, but also cultural and emotional. The illusion also shapes how resources are used. Instead of investing aggressively in the future, in industries that redefine the next century, in education that matches the pace of new technology, and in infrastructure that keeps it competitive, resources are too often poured into maintaining the appearance of power. Vast sums are spent to project dominance abroad, while cracks in domestic foundations go unaddressed. Roads decay, public trust erodes, healthcare burdens grow, and inequality widens. Yet the illusion of endless power convinces leaders that these issues are manageable, secondary or less urgent than proving to the world that America remains supreme. But true power has never been about appearances. It has always been about resilience, about how a nation responds when the world changes direction. The illusion also blinds leadership to the most important truth. Power today is no longer unipolar. The age where one country could dictate the rules and expect compliance without resistance is over. Technology has leveled the playing field. New alliances have emerged, and capital now flows where opportunity exists, not just where dominance once was. Believing in endless power delays the painful but necessary process of adaptation. Instead of embracing cooperation, diversification, and shared influence, America risks clinging to a world order that no longer exists. The longer the illusion is maintained, the harder the eventual adjustment will be, and the more exposed the weakness becomes. Consider also the role of time. Every empire in history has believed it would last forever. From Rome to the Ottomans, from the British Empire to the Soviet Union, each believed its power was too entrenched to be challenged. Yet the common thread in their decline was the same. They mistook dominance for permanence. America today risks repeating this historical pattern, not because it lacks the resources to lead, but because it fails to recognize that leadership must be constantly re-earned. The illusion of endless power creates a dangerous gap between perception and reality. And in that gap, rivals advance, allies hesitate, and the internal strength of the nation erodes quietly. Ultimately, the illusion of endless power is not just America's greatest weakness. It is the most universal weakness of any great power. The difference is that America, more than any other nation, has tied its identity, its system, and its global role to the belief that its dominance cannot be replaced. That is why the exposure of this illusion is so critical. Once the world sees that America is not invulnerable, once its rivals see that it struggles to adapt, and once its own people begin to feel the cracks in their daily lives, the myth of endless dominance disappears. And when a myth disappears, the reality it once covered can no longer be hidden. The story of America's rise has always been tied to its ability to innovate faster than anyone else. From the assembly line to the microchip, from the internet to biotechnology, the strength of the nation rested on a culture that celebrated creation over protection, disruption over preservation, bold risk over safe management. That was the energy that drove it to lead the world, the fuel that powered its companies to expand globally, and the spirit that made its universities the hubs of groundbreaking ideas. But over time, that spirit began to shift. Innovation, once the heart of American growth, began to take second place to something far less sustainable. Control, instead of building new markets and pioneering industries that did not exist, more and more energy was spent trying to maintain dominance by controlling the flow of capital, technology, and influence. And in this shift lies the true weakness that has now been exposed. Control appears strong on the surface. When you control the world's reserve currency, you can dictate financial systems. When you control global trade networks, you can set the rules of exchange. When you control access to technology, you can decide who advances and who lags behind. For decades, This appeared to be the perfect formula for maintaining dominance. But control has limits, and those limits are far more fragile than they appear. Innovation, by contrast, creates new wealth, new systems, and new power from the ground up. Control tries to freeze the world in a shape that benefits you. Innovation reshapes the world so that you continue to benefit no matter what. When a nation forgets this balance, it begins to confuse enforcement with leadership. And enforcement without creation is always temporary. The drive to control has become most visible in technology. In earlier decades, America's strength was that its companies created technologies others could not match. Whether it was software, hardware, or entire digital platforms, they set the pace for the world. But as other nations invested heavily in their own innovation, the response has too often been defensive. Restrictions, sanctions, barriers, and efforts to slow others down instead of pulling further ahead. This reveals a deeper truth. It is easier to try to block others from competing than to reinvent yourself to stay ahead. But history is unforgiving to nations that choose the path of restriction over creation. Once you start managing decline rather than building growth, you have already accepted the loss of your original advantage. Control also changes the mindset of leadership. When innovation leads, leaders think about the future, about where the next opportunities lie, about how to build ecosystems that others will want to join. But when control dominates, leaders think about protection, about preventing rivals from catching up, about using rules and systems to lock others out, rather than using ideas to invite others in. This shift of mentality may not be obvious day to day, but it corrodes the foundation of competitiveness. Companies spend less time on research and more time on compliance. Policymakers spend less energy in invention and more energy negotiating trade disputes. The culture of risk-taking is replaced by a culture of defending territory. Over time, this makes the system slower, less adaptable, and far more exposed when disruption inevitably comes from somewhere else. There is also a cost to the global reputation of a nation that relies on control. Innovation inspires. When the world sees breakthroughs in science, in medicine, in technology, it naturally gravitates toward the source of those ideas. Influence flows effortlessly to the innovator because others want to participate in growth. But when the world sees a nation primarily trying to control others, it does not inspire, it intimidates. And intimidation breeds resistance. Allies begin to look for alternatives. Rivals accelerate their independence, and neutral players hedge their bets. The result is the slow erosion of the very influence that control was meant to preserve. This is the paradox. The more control is used as a substitute for innovation, the faster influence slips away. The economy also reflects this weakness. Innovation expands the pie. It creates industries that did not exist, jobs that were unimaginable, and wealth that multiplies far beyond the original idea. Control, by contrast, redistributes the same pie. It tries to take more for itself by limiting others, but it does not expand the total opportunity. For a while, this may seem effective, but eventually it breeds stagnation. Economies that grow primarily by protecting existing advantages rather than creating new ones eventually lose their dynamism. The signs of this are already visible: slower productivity growth, widening inequality, and a culture of short-term profit taking over long-term investment. An economy that once symbolized endless possibility now often seems trapped in cycles of protectionism and political deadlock. Unable to summon the boldness that once defined it, this dependence on control has also created vulnerability in global competition. Other nations, once content to follow America's lead, now see that the path to influence does not come from aligning with old systems, but from building alternatives. Whether in finance, energy, or digital platforms, the race is no longer about joining what already exists, but about creating parallel structures that reduce dependence on American systems. The more America tries to tighten control, the greater the incentive for others to innovate their way out of that control. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. America restricts, others innovate to bypass, and the act of restriction accelerates the very independence it feared. What was once an unquestioned dominance now faces new ecosystems that are not only competitive, but in some cases more agile, more inclusive, and more appealing to the next generation of leaders around the world. Culturally, dependence on control rather than innovation weakens the spirit of the people themselves. When a society thrives on innovation, it celebrates creativity, rewards curiosity, and empowers risk takers to challenge the status quo. But when the system emphasizes control, risk is punished, creativity is sidelined, and conformity is rewarded. Over time, this shifts the values of the younger generation. Instead of dreaming of building the next world, changing company, many dream of securing stability within controlled structures. This quiet erosion of ambition is not as visible as economic statistics, but it is far more damaging in the long run because it shapes the mindset of those who will define the future. The global stage only magnifies this weakness. Nations that innovate gain moral authority because their progress benefits humanity as a whole. A new vaccine, a new energy source, a new platform. These lift not only the nation that created them, but also those who adopt them. Control, on the other hand, benefits only the one who wields it, and often at the expense of others. This difference matters in a connected world where influence is as much about soft power as hard power. When others see you as the source of progress, they follow willingly. When they see you as the enforcer of rules, they comply reluctantly, and only until they can find another option. The greatest irony is that America still possesses the resources, the talent, and the institutions to lead through innovation once again. The weakness is not a lack of capacity, but a shift in priorities. By focusing on control, it has begun to forget that its true strength has always come from its ability to imagine, to reinvent, and to inspire. If this weakness remains unaddressed, the future will not belong to those who can enforce the past, but to those who can create the future. At the core of every great power lies something more fragile and yet more powerful than armies, currencies, or treaties. It is trust. Trust is the invisible glue that binds people to their leaders, allies to their agreements, and rivals to the idea that rules will be respected. When trust exists, power multiplies because it requires less force to maintain order and influence. When trust erodes, even the strongest structures collapse under the weight of doubt. America's greatest weakness today is not just the challenge of rivals or the pressure of global competition. It is the erosion of trust in its leadership, both at home and abroad. And this erosion is exposing vulnerabilities that were once hidden under the illusion of permanence domestically. The erosion of trust is visible in the relationship between leaders and the people. For decades, the promise was simple. Hard work would be rewarded, institutions would protect fairness, and the government would act in the interest of its citizens. That promise held the nation together, even during turbulent times. But over the years, cracks in that trust have widened. Inequality has deepened. Opportunities feel unevenly distributed, and political leaders seem more interested in scoring points against each other than solving structural problems. Citizens watch as wealth concentrates in fewer hands, as policies shift with partisan winds, and as promises of reform rarely translate into lasting change. The result is cynicism, and cynicism is the soil in which distrust grows. When people stop believing that their leaders represent them, the unity that once fueled national strength begins to fragment. This erosion of trust extends beyond politics and into institutions. Banks, corporations, universities, and media outlets once carried reputations as pillars of reliability. Today, many of them face declining confidence from the very people they are supposed to serve. Scandals, corruption, manipulation, and perceived dishonesty have chipped away at the sense that these institutions operate in good faith. Without trust, every message is doubted, every policy is questioned, and every initiative is met with suspicion. A society that no longer trusts its institutions struggles to mobilize around collective goals. This makes it harder to respond to crises, harder to build consensus, and harder to sustain long-term commitments that demand sacrifice in the present for rewards in the future. Internationally, the erosion of trust is even more dangerous. For decades, America's leadership in the global system rested not only on its material strength, but also on the belief that it would honor its word. Alliances such as NATO, economic frameworks such as the Bretton Woods system, and countless bilateral agreements were all built on the perception that America's commitments were reliable. But in recent years, allies have begun to question whether those commitments can still be counted on sudden policy reversals, inconsistent leadership across administrations, and the prioritization of short-term domestic politics over long-term global stability have raised doubts. When allies feel uncertain, they hedge by building their own security structures, exploring new economic ties, and reducing dependence on America's guarantees. This weakens the very alliances that once magnified American influence. Trust also matters with rivals. Even adversaries respect rules when they believe those rules will be enforced fairly and consistently. But when America's leadership appears unpredictable, rivals interpret it as both a weakness and an opportunity. They exploit the inconsistency, testing boundaries in ways that would have been unthinkable before. Every time a red line is blurred or a commitment is abandoned, the perception of reliability diminishes further. In the realm of diplomacy, credibility is often more valuable than raw power. If rivals no longer trust that America will act as it says, the deterrence that once kept balance in the system erodes, and the likelihood of miscalculation rises economically. The erosion of trust has profound consequences. The global financial system runs on confidence that agreements will be honored, contracts respected, and obligations met. America's greatest asset in this realm has long been the dollar, not only as a currency, but as a symbol of reliability. Yet as fiscal instability grows, as political gridlock threatens debt obligations, and as sanctions are used as tools of control, trust in the financial system begins to weaken. Nations and corporations alike start looking for alternatives, hedging their reserves with other currencies, or experimenting with entirely new systems of exchange. Once trust in the financial system begins to erode, it is extremely difficult to rebuild, because financial trust is built on decades of consistent reliability, not on short-term promises culturally. The erosion of trust feeds division. When citizens no longer trust their leaders, they often stop trusting each other. Political polarization becomes sharper, social cohesion frays, and groups retreat into silos, where mistrust is amplified by echo chambers. This weakens the social fabric and reduces the resilience of the nation. A society that mistrusts itself struggles to mobilize in times of crisis, because every action by leadership is questioned as partisan, manipulative, or self-serving. Trust in leadership is not only about those at the top, it is about whether citizens believe they share a common future. Without that belief, every challenge becomes a battleground rather than an opportunity for collective progress. The erosion of trust also has a psychological impact on the global stage. For much of the modern era, America's leadership symbolized stability. Countries aligned with it because they believed it provided a sense of order. But when trust erodes, America no longer appears as the anchor of stability, but as another unpredictable actor in a volatile world. This shift in perception encourages nations to diversify their partnerships, to turn to regional powers, or to build entirely new frameworks outside of America's reach. What begins as small hedges gradually grows into systemic shifts. And over time, the global order that once revolved around American leadership fragments into competing spheres of influence in history. No empire has collapsed solely because of external threats. The decisive factor has always been internal. The loss of trust between rulers and the ruled, between promises and reality, between projection and truth. Rome fell not only to invaders, but to corruption and disillusionment. The Soviet Union collapsed, not simply because of economic weakness, but because its citizens stopped believing in the system. America now faces the same test. Its military remains powerful, its economy still vast, and its culture still influential. But power without trust is brittle. Once people stop believing in the leadership that guides it, the strength of those assets diminishes rapidly. The erosion of trust in leadership is not sudden, but gradual. It begins with small betrayals of confidence, small contradictions between words and actions, small failures to honor commitments over time. These accumulate until the entire system is viewed with suspicion. Rebuilding trust requires consistency, transparency, and a willingness to prioritize long-term credibility over short-term advantage. But the danger now is that America's leadership has grown so accustomed to projecting strength that it underestimates how fragile trust really is. Once lost, it cannot simply be commanded back. It must be earned slowly. And in the meantime, the weakness it reveals becomes a growing vulnerability in a world that no longer waits for leaders to restore their credibility. Every great nation throughout history has faced a turning point when it had to decide whether to cling to the past or embrace the future. The difference between survival and decline has never been about sheer size, wealth, or military power, but about foresight, the ability to recognize the direction of change and adapt faster than others. America's greatest weakness today lies in its growing inability to read the future of global shifts. While resources, technology, and talent remain abundant, the mindset that once allowed it to predict, prepare, and pioneer new eras has been clouded by nostalgia for a world that no longer exists. In a rapidly changing global landscape, misreading the signals of the future is not just a mistake. It is an exposure of vulnerability that others are eager to exploit. The first misreading comes from economics. For decades, America assumed that its financial dominance would remain unchallenged, that the dollar would always be the unquestioned medium of exchange, and that its markets would always be the ultimate destination for global investment. That assumption blinded it to the fact that other nations have been building new economic frameworks that bypass traditional systems. Regional trade agreements, digital currencies, and alternative financial networks are rising at a pace once dismissed as insignificant. Instead of engaging with these shifts early and shaping them, the instinct has too often been to protect existing structures. But protection is not strategy. The world economy is tilting toward multipolarity, and clinging to a unipolar mindset means reacting too late when the balance has already shifted. The second misreading is in technology. America has always been the birthplace of transformative innovations: the internet, personal computing, biotechnology, artificial intelligence. But as other nations pour unprecedented investment into research and development, the landscape is no longer as one-sided as it once was. The assumption that breakthroughs will continue to emerge primarily from Silicon Valley is being challenged by global labs, universities, and entrepreneurial ecosystems. The danger lies in underestimating how quickly the geography of innovation is changing. Technologies like renewable energy, quantum computing, space exploration, and next-generation manufacturing are no longer guaranteed to be American-led. By misreading the pace and location of these shifts, America risks falling into a defensive stance where it tries to regulate and restrict rather than accelerate its own capacity to outpace competitors. The third misreading is geopolitical. For decades, global order was built on the belief that alliances formed around American leadership would remain unquestioned. Yet the world is now moving toward a network of flexible, interest-driven partnerships that no longer revolve around a single center of gravity. Regional powers are asserting independence, middle powers are playing balancing games, and new coalitions are forming outside traditional Western frameworks. The assumption that America's alliances are permanent and unshakable has led to complacency in diplomacy. While others build new bridges, America risks clinging to structures that reflect the past century rather than the emerging one. This is a critical weakness because influence in the future will depend less on inherited alliances and more on the agility to form new, adaptive relationships in real time. Another misreading lies in energy and resources. The 20th century was defined by oil and gas dominance, much of it under American influence. The 21st century, however, is moving toward renewable energy, battery storage, and new forms of resource competition such as rare earth minerals. Nations that invest heavily in these areas today will control the supply chains of tomorrow. Yet America, despite its scientific capability, has often treated these shifts as secondary or as political debates rather than strategic imperatives. The assumption that the old energy order will continue is not just outdated but dangerous because it leaves room for rivals to dominate the industries that will define the future economy. Once again, the weakness lies not in resources but in vision, in failing to anticipate how the value of resources themselves is being redefined. There is also a misreading of demographics and society. The world's growth is shifting toward younger, faster growing populations in Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. These regions are not only markets of the future, but also sources of innovation, culture, and geopolitical weight. America's weakness is in assuming that global influence will always remain centered in aging Western populations with slower growth. By overlooking the potential of younger societies and failing to build stronger ties with them, America risks alienating the very partners that will define the next global era. Influence follows dynamism, and dynamism is shifting away from traditional centers of power. To misread this is to underestimate where momentum is headed culturally. There is a misreading of perception. For much of modern history, America was seen as the symbol of opportunity, freedom, and progress. But global perception is not static. Younger generations worldwide are increasingly skeptical, questioning whether America's system still represents the ideals it once projected. When cultural trust declines, soft power erodes, and soft power has always been America's greatest amplifier. The assumption that its cultural dominance will continue indefinitely ignores the rise of alternative cultural spheres powered by technology, entertainment, and social media platforms that transcend geography. By misreading the changing cultural landscape, America risks losing one of its most subtle but decisive tools of influence. Underlying all of these misreadings is a deeper pattern: the belief that the future will mirror the past. This belief has locked policymakers, institutions, and even businesses into a defensive posture, one that tries to preserve existing advantages rather than anticipate new realities. But the future rarely follows the same script. Every major global transformation, from the fall of empires to the rise of industrial revolutions, has caught dominant powers off guard because they assumed continuity where there was none. America today faces the same danger, not because it lacks power, but because it misreads how quickly the definitions of power are changing. The cost of misreading the future is cumulative. Each mistake alone may seem manageable, but together they form a pattern of decline. Misreading economic shifts weakens financial dominance. Misreading technological trends slows competitiveness. Misreading alliances erodes geopolitical influence. Misreading energy transitions surrenders future industries. Misreading demographics disconnects from global momentum. and misreading culture diminishes soft power. The combination of these missteps exposes a vulnerability that rivals are already exploiting. By seeing the world through the lens of the past, America risks being unprepared for the world that is emerging before its eyes. The most profound weakness, then, is not that America lacks capacity, but that it risks misdirecting it. The resources to lead remain immense: cutting-edge universities, innovative companies, global networks, and unmatched financial infrastructure. But capacity without vision cannot prevent decline. If leadership continues to misread the signals of transformation, these strengths will not be enough to maintain influence in a world that is moving in new directions at a pace faster than ever before.